Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back. Today I thought it'd be fun to find out if disabled people belong in sci-fi and fantasy from a disabled person. So I recently saw this video called Do Disabled People Belong in Sci-Fi and Fantasy, which was made by Steve Shives, who I'll link below in the video as well. And he is reacting to a Twitter/X post in which the person discusses, it's Twitter, okay, whether disabled people belong in sci-fi and fantasy, or rather why they don't. So anyway, let's watch the video together because I have a few things to say as a disabled person myself.
Most popular science fiction and fantasy stories are set in worlds where, thanks to the existence of advanced technology or magic, problems which we find challenging or even insurmountable in the real world can be easily overcome. Does it make sense for characters to have visible disabilities at all? Do disabled people even belong in sci-fi fantasy? Yes! What the hell kind of question is that? Should there be disabled characters in sci-fi fantasy? Yes!
Okay, also, that was a fun frame to pause on. Also, yeah, given that sci-fi and fantasy solve a lot of regular people problem, like, what's the point of even having able-bodied people? Honestly.
Easy! I've got a far more vexing question to ask in response. What the hell is wrong with people? Here's what got me on this subject, or back on this subject, I should say, since I already addressed it a while back when I did a video in my Trek Actually series about disability representation in Star Trek. And what I said there applies more broadly beyond Star Trek as well. The other day, I saw some folks repost.
I haven't seen that video about Star Trek, but I'll watch it. I think it sounds interesting.
Posting and responding to this tweet. Please bear with me as I read the entire thing. It literally makes no sense to have disabled people in a fantasy setting. 1, why can't the disabled person cast a spell on their broken legs that fixes them instantly so they can walk again? 2, if the mage's lower body is paralyzed rather than physically broken, then why can't they remove the paralysis using magic? 3, why can't the mage cast a spell on themselves which allows them to float or to fly so that they don't have to worry about walking? 4, why is there a normal-looking wheelchair in a medieval-esque high fantasy setting? Shouldn't the chair be made out of crude dwarven technology or be replaced with an animal with a saddle attached to it? Once you have...
See, it makes more sense to use magic to move because you don't have legs or if you can't walk or whatever than it does to use magic to go somewhere because you're too lazy or because, like, you have to be somewhere far away in 5 minutes, right? Like, at least with a disabled person, there's a reason to do it. For the able-bodied person, it's just like, woo! Humans are boring. Okay. Why is there a normal... Disabled people are boring too, don't worry about it. Why is there a normal-looking wheelchair in a medieval? I don't know. Time traveler? That's... Hey, sci-fi within fantasy. How about them apples?
Have magic in a setting, it makes no sense to have disabilities. The only way you can make this work is if you make the magic extremely rare and difficult to obtain, or make it so that magic is so dangerous and unreliable that it rarely gets used. In other words, you would have to heavily tone down the fantasy in high fantasy, which kind of defeats the purpose. A low magic fantasy setting can work, but it requires good writing to make it interesting. First off, good to know that there are apparently subgenres of fiction that don't require good writing to make them
Yeah, so A, it only works if you're a crappy writer, and B, if you're a narrow-minded nincompoop, which the person who probably wrote this Twitter thing might be one of the two.
Interesting. I bet that saves time. So I shared a screen grab of this tweet because to hell with retweeting this ableist clown, where I pretty much torched this person, pointing out that disabled people can exist in fantasy or sci-fi settings because they, you know, exist in reality. And good stories aren't just about what they're literally about. They're also about real people and real stuff. Metaphor, allegory, symbolism. These are not exactly rarely utilized devices in fiction.
Can I just say also, if we're... Okay, take fantasy first, okay? At what point do you aspire to be the mammal with 2 thumbs? Like, there are dragons, dwarves, mages, like, I don't know. So many other things you could be. They're so much better than a human, even if he's able-bodied or her, whatever. I think, at what point do you consider, like, I think there's some conversation to have between a human that evolved and so has a difference between the baseline human or, like, the baseline creature and a disability. Like, I think that would be, I have no idea where the line is, okay? But, like, I'm sure there's some correlation between disability and evolution. Just have to point that out. And same in sci-fi. Like, if the point of technology or whatever in sci-fi is to make life easier or to facilitate something or to make something cooler or whatever, then if you have a tool that allows you to do something, that how is it penalizing for the person using the tool to not be able to do something that the tool does? Riddle me that.
Particularly fantasy or science fiction. If the world of a fantasy story represents our world, and our world includes people with disabilities, why shouldn't the world of the fantasy story include them also?
And yes, we are here.
Oh, this really isn't that fucking hard, is it? But I got a reply to my series of tweets, and this reply informed me that I had it all wrong. The reply says, Steve, you're wrong on this. No one wants to be disabled, but in a fantasy or sci-fi setting with either magic or space tech, we'd eliminate these kinds of problems. It takes a greater imagination to justify disabled people, rather than just include disabled people. Let me take this a piece at a time. Steve, you're wrong on this. Always a possibility. Generally speaking, I'm right as fuck about this, but I've been
Everyone's been wrong before. It's fine. We've all been there.
wrong about lots of other stuff, so an understandable mistake on your part. No one wants to be disabled. I find this to be a presumptuous statement.
Okay, so I think what the person who wrote this meant to say was no one who is already disabled, or no one who is not yet disabled wants to become disabled, is how you read it anyway. Which is probably a fair statement to make, and I wouldn't really say anything against it. That's not to say that people who are disabled aspire to not be disabled anymore. That's more of a case-by-case question, I think.
I can say, as a typically able person, that I would not want to be disabled.
Steve, you're going on too long about this.
Perhaps, if I don't want to ever have the right to argue, that seems to be the level we're at. But in a fantasy or sci-fi setting with either magic or space tech, we'd eliminate these kinds of problems. Says who? Do you speak for all sci-fi fantasy authors?
What kind of problems? If by problem you're referring to people with disability, no, like that's a very verifiable hypothesis, okay? Let me put it this way. 100 years ago, 200 years ago, people might have been writing about like sci-fi stuff about technologies that we have today. And did we get rid of disabled people?
Everywhere? Are those who have included disabled characters in their stories simply doing it wrong? Let's say you create a fantasy setting for your story where, thanks to technology or magic or whatever, disabilities have been completely eliminated. Okay, you're the writer, you tell the story how you want to tell it. But let's say I create a fantasy setting for a story I'm writing, and in my story, some people still have disabilities. What now? What are you going to do? We'd eliminate those kinds of problems, unless the author who's making up that story says different. Again, this really isn't complicated. Last piece, it takes a greater imagination to justify disabled people, rather than just include disabled people, perhaps. And you know what? If someone is writing a sci-fi...
Even able-bodied people have random problems. So I don't know how including disabled people, you're just opening yourself to a different range of problems that people might have, which also opens yourself to different, story possibilities. I forget the word. Anyway, yeah, you have more story writing possibilities with disabled people. And honestly, I think just having able-bodied people is just such a plot convenience, okay? Like, if everyone is able to do everything you need them to do at all times, then isn't that just boring? I think if you do that, you're a bored writer. And if you specifically exclude disabled people from your story because you can't come up with a creative storyline, then you're a bored writer. That's my thought on it.
Or fantasy story, and as part of that
bored and boring.
That story, they invent an in-universe explanation for why there are still disabled people, despite the existence of advanced technology or magic or whatever. If a writer does that, more power to them. I have no objection to that in principle. But if a writer is...
And yeah, I mean, if you don't include disabled people, like, obviously you can't have every single human that has ever been in every single story. You don't have to include disabled people by any means. But if you're not including disabled people because you yourself cannot imagine a disabled person in that scenario, then yeah, that is a problem.
Is telling a sci-fi fantasy story, and that writer wants to include characters with disabilities, and that writer doesn't feel like explaining why disabled people still exist in this fantasy world, maybe because the story they're telling doesn't actually have anything to do with that, and inserting exposition solely to justify the presence of disabled people would be a waste of time and, bad storytelling, guess what? They don't have to explain a goddamn thing. Explaining every tiny little detail about why things are the way they are in the fictional world is not storytelling. That is pedantry. And I know pedantry is the official sport of online fandom, but that only makes me more determined to take a fucking bat to it whenever I encounter it.
Yeah, so... Okay, let me put it this way. Yeah, you can have disabled... Insert any adjective instead of disabled, okay? You can have disabled characters in a story and it not, the plot not revolve around disability at all. I actually yearn for way more stories like that, because whenever there's a disabled person, it's like the plot point. Or like a narrative tool, like a major narrative tool, right? Like the girl next door has cancer and the nice boy comes over because he has pity and like the girl dies happy from her disability, but she's happy, so whatever. Something like that. I don't know. I'm not pointing any fingers, but... yeah, you can have characters with any trait, be it disability, ethnicity, culture, whatever, and it have nothing to do with the plot. I actually think it makes a book way more interesting. Sometimes there are characters that are amputees. Sometimes there are characters who have coily hair. Sometimes there are characters who are 5 feet tall. Sometimes there are characters that are 4 feet tall. Sometimes there are characters that are 6.5 feet tall, and it has nothing to do with the plot. And the whole story is something completely different. It's about like chess or something. I don't know. I'm just making something up, right? But personally, I think it's interesting to have characters with traits that have nothing to do with the plot. B, I think it still is interesting to give depth and relatability to a character, to give some description on their background, or even just physical description, even if you don't explain why, right? You have to have a balance between including characters of where their characteristics, be it disability or anything else, is it a plot device? Not necessarily the plot point, but maybe plays into how things turn out. And also a balance between that and characters that have a characteristic that has nothing to do, that has no impact whatsoever on the storyline. Both are interesting. I do think it's cool to mention it anyway, just for character depth.
Disabled characters can exist in sci-fi fantasy stories for no other reason than the creators of those stories want them to be there. The existence of disabled people in fiction doesn't need to be justified because the existence of disabled people in the real world doesn't need to be justified. Disabled people have a right to be here. Period. And no, it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not disabled people as a group or any particular disabled person wants to be disabled. Representation can be a form of wish fulfillment, but it doesn't have to be. Some disabled people, I assume, enjoy sci-fi fantasy stories as a form of escapism, where they can imagine themselves living in a world where their disability would have been prevented or healed or accommodated in some way that's impossible in reality. But some disabled people, again, I assume, enjoy sci-fi fantasy stories that include disabled characters because they like the reminder that having a disability doesn't mean you can't have an exciting, adventure-filled life. And, I'm about to blow your mind, grab onto something, I also assume that there are some disabled people, perhaps even a great many, who enjoy both of those things at different times in different stories.
Yeah, just like Steve said, some people want to see people like themselves in a story. Some people want to imagine what their life would be like if they had technology, magic, whatever. Some people like both, and some people like neither. To be honest, I think it would be cool and creative to see more characters like me, but I don't pick up books. I wouldn't pick up a book specifically because there is a character like me in it.
Oh, but I can hear the swelling cry even now. Internal consistency, Steve. What about internal consistency? How will we ever maintain...
That's the sound of the internet.
...immersion in the story without internal consistency? Someone a bit further down in the replies to my tweets about this came up with the perfect comeback to that whiny-ass bit of fan entitlement. When you see someone using a manual...
Also, what is that? What would that even mean, internal consistency? Like, what would that look like in this context? I don't think this is really applicable.
Wheelchair, knowing that mechanical wheelchairs exist. Do you demand an explanation? Does that break your immersion with fucking reality? Or do you just assume there must be a reason and get on with your life? Or better yet, does it not even occur to you in the first place? Because who the fuck even cares? I've got another rebuttal by way of example to the, but my internal consistency.
That is really dumb. Like, why would you buy crappy shoes knowing that good quality shoes exist in real life? Right? Like, that's so dumb. That's That would be such a dumb argument to me, but anyway. Why would you wear multiple layers of t-shirts when you could wear one sweater when it's cold outside?
See, objection. You remember how, when Arnold Schwarzenegger first started making movies where he played American characters, the writers always felt the need to throw in a little explanation for why he had a heavy Austrian accent? They'd throw in a line about how Arnold's character was an immigrant or something. But eventually, the writers and directors of Schwarzenegger movies stopped doing that. Why? Because they realized that it didn't matter. If the origin of Arnold's accent wasn't part of the story being told, and it almost never was, then explaining it was a waste of time. Why does an American cop or a killer robot from the future speak with that accent? It doesn't matter. And if you're hung up on that, you're paying attention to the wrong thing. When you watch Star Trek The Next...
Yeah, that is... Not everything needs to have a reason in books or movies or whatever. Not everything has to have a reason, A. B, not everything that has a reason needs to be explained. Did you know that Schwarzenegger... I wish him all the best, okay? Like, I heard on the radio a few weeks ago that apparently he got a pacemaker. So now, and I don't know if it was the radio host or she was quoting Arnold Schwarzenegger, but she's like, ooh, he's a real Terminator now. And I was like, I love that attitude. So anyway, now your beloved Schwarzenegger is a disabled person.
Generation.
Side note, probably everyone on this planet is going to be disabled at some point. By the way, I hate to break the bubble, but this is true. So why not just include yourself while you still can?
Does it destroy your immersion whenever the supposedly French Captain Jean-Luc Picard speaks in the very British accent of Patrick Stewart? Or, no, I bet you have a headcanon to explain.
Doesn't it break the immersion when people from different planets speak English? Or from a galaxy far, far away speak English? And other languages? That is bad story writing.
In a way, that world-breaking inconsistency, don't you? I want to drown you in a toilet. By the same token as the Schwarzenegger bit, not the toilet drowning bit, which was hyperbole. I don't literally want to drown you in a toilet. I don't even know you. I'm only speaking in second person as a rhetorical device anyway, so you don't even exist. But if you're watching a sci-fi fantasy movie or TV show where there just happens to be a character with a disability and there's no explanation for it because the story isn't about their disability or why they have it, and you're stuck on that because the story takes place in a high-tech or magical setting, that's on you. You are paying attention to the wrong thing. Let me also pause a moment before I wrap this.
Let me just say this. Did you watch the whole Terminator movies or the whole Terminator franchise and need a specific reason why the Terminator has brown hair? Like, no, it doesn't matter if the Terminator was blonde or brunette or like had black hair or whatever. Like, some shit doesn't matter. It's just there. Okay? Like, some things are just.
This up to note that disabled people don't belong.
Just are. Sorry.
In sci-fi fantasy is fundamentally no different than saying black people don't belong in sci-fi fantasy. I've been a Star Trek fan pretty much my entire life. When I was 14, when Star Trek Voyager premiered, I remember how some Trekkies reacted to the presence of Tuvok, a black Vulcan, in the cast of that show. I was online by then, and there was enough quote-unquote controversy within certain corners of the fan base regarding whether or not black Vulcans made sense that Kate Orman, herself a published sci-fi author, felt the need to publish a black Vulcan FAQ to the Rec Art Star Trek Usenet news group. It's still accessible in Google's group archive. You should check it out. There's a link to it in the video description. Anyway, because I remembered that should there be black Vulcans bullshit.
Yeah. Sometimes when I hear information like this, which I didn't know before watching this video, I just think, man, sure are a lot of Nimrods out there.
When I saw the should there be someone using a wheelchair bullshit in response to a background character in Star Trek Discovery a few years ago, I recognized it for what it was right away. Just as I recognized this, do disabled people belong in sci-fi fantasy settings?
Okay, but like this whole why do you need a wheelchair or why can't we have wheelchairs or whatever? It's like, okay, why can't you just use a regular desk chair instead of a desk chair with wheels on it? Like, are your able-bodied legs too weak to walk to the other side of your room, or do you have to wheel there?
Bullshit for what it is.
You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of people like, oh, why is there one tool instead of another when the other is just a slight difference? It's like, yeah, because that exists in real life for able-bodied people too. Like,
disguise it in a concern for internal consistency or verisimilitude. You can say you're just asking for writers to be more imaginative and provide explanations for why disabilities still exist in their magical, fantastical, futuristic worlds, but you can't hide the truth of what you're doing. Treating people with disabilities like trespassers in your fantasy, or people of color, or queer people, or any other group of people you're not comfortable with, because in your fantasy world, those people don't exist. We know what's going on. If the mere presence of disabled people in such a setting reads as a plot hole to you, if it breaks your immersion, that's not bad writing. That's your pedantic bullshit. Writers are under no obligation to cater to your pedantic bullshit. And if you ask me, they do it too much already, which is a favor to you if you think—
Oh, yeah. Writers, screenwriters, everywhere do it way too much. Like, it's ridiculous. Which is really sad because we have impacted everyone's daily life more than you know. More than you know. And I'll give you one example. The text message that people do that every day, multiple times a day. Well, that was for deaf people who couldn't take a phone call. So what, are you just going to stop texting because you're anti-disability? And there's a lot more where that came from, by the way.
Think about it, so maybe you should pay it forward and do the rest of us a favor, stop complaining, and from now on keep your pedantic bullshit, and your bigotry, and your pissy entitlement, and your fragile, feeble, one-dimensional reading comprehension the fuck to yourself.
On the one hand, I feel like, yes, there is very little disability representation. That's a fact in books, in movies, TV shows, you name it. I think across the board in the entertainment industry, there's just either a misrepresentation of disability, be it physical or mental, but also just lack thereof. And honestly, in movies and TV shows, a lot of times the roles, well, books as well, but the roles are written by people who are not disabled without the input of disabled people, oftentimes played by people who don't have a disability or that disability for the few times that they do have a disability. So that is a problem. On the other hand, I feel like people just have to shift their perception of what disability is and could look like in fiction. And I mean this for outside of sci-fi and fantasy as well, but a lot of times I think people assimilate disability more or less rightfully so, right? As the word implies, disability, lack of your ability to do something, as the implication being that you would be able to do if you were able-bodied, right? Okay. Sometimes when I hear these conversations, like what I just saw, I'm kind of like, do we watch the same movies and read the same books? Because a lot of times people don't want to talk about what disability could look like. All right. We have a lot of talk, like I said earlier, lack of representation. There's also the whole, mental is an illness as a disability is utilized as a tool for villains, right? I feel like you used to have villains that are mean just because they're mean. And now in fiction, you have villains because like they have a backstory and actually they went crazy or they have a mental illness and that's why they're mean and blah, 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 and whatever. First of all, can we bring back just assholes for the sake of being assholes? Okay, anyway. But also, can we talk about the fact that there's a whole franchise of what I would qualify as disabled people as superheroes, right? Like X-Men, hello? I don't think any of the X-Men as individuals in society would qualify as able-bodied, yet there's a whole franchise of them being superheroes. Let's think of a whole franchise in sci-fi where two amputees duke it out, surrounded by a bunch of elderly people. Star Wars? Bet you didn't think of Anakin and Luke as amputees. But they are, and they're very much disabled, and all the main Jedi, Yoda, is like a fucking old dude. He's like an elderly citizen. Like, I think he's too old to even qualify for McDonald's senior citizen coffee discount. Well, I don't think being old constitutes a disability, but it is a main factor in disability. The guy needs a cane. Okay, so that's basically a disability. Yet he's like the main guy. Luke, I don't know which arm it was, can't remember. I think it was his right arm actually, but chopped off. And I know what a lot of people are going to say, oh, but it doesn't count because he got a prosthetic arm. And like, yeah, go say that to all the amputees out there who have a prosthetic leg or prosthetic limb or whatever. And it's like, that's what I was saying earlier. The point of living in a sci-fi universe with advanced technology is that if you do have medical problems or disabilities, you can compensate for it with other technology, right? Like even, like Anakin's more than an amputee. That was an understatement. I know, I get it. Trust. But see what I mean? See what I mean? Also, I don't really watch a lot of superhero movies, so it's not like I know them all. But like, to me, the two most boring ones have always been Iron Man and Batman. And I was like, you know, I think it's because they don't really have anything. They're billionaires with tools. Like, they themselves don't have anything. They're just regular humans with stuff. A lot of money and fancy tools. Cool. I think that's what makes superheroes special, right? They have something about their body that is different. And I know a lot of people they're going to be like, oh, but there's a difference between having a superpower and being disabled. Is there? I think one is the extension of the other. You know how people talk about like blind people or deaf people having a sixth sense or whatever because like they lost a sense and I don't know, they have another one ready. They have another one at the ready or something. I don't know. When you're disabled, you experience the world differently. And so you adapt differently. And so you do things that able-bodied people wouldn't think of doing or wouldn't think of having the need of doing, or you notice things about your surroundings that able-bodied people wouldn't. And so I think there's a strong correlation to explore between having a disabled character and having them become the superhero or become extra able-bodied. That wasn't really the word I was looking for, but I don't know. Anyway. The other thing I want to point out, specifically in sci-fi, is the whole universe of medical experiments, okay? Because in sci-fi, especially if you look at books, I'm thinking specifically of books like The Island of Dr. Moreau. I think it's undeniable that the history of disability is, the history of, or the medical history is super duper duper dark. And so I think, and I love horror, so it's fantabulous. So I think it's a really interesting part of fiction you could tap into if you did like a speculative sci-fi. That would be very cool. Or maybe you could bring that into fantasy as well. But I think that you should recognize the presence of disability in that as well. I'm also thinking of sci-fi where people inspire the sci-fi technology from what we have today. CRISPR, brain implants, whatever. All the AI tools we have. In the medical field, people are using technology to heal what we already have, right? So like prolonging our body's lifespan or helping us heal wounds. Like if you were in a car crash and your spine was broken, having a chip or something to help you walk again, or if cochlear implants to help you hear again, or LASIK. What's the future of LASIK? So you can see even better than 2020? I don't know. As of today, technology is wanting to enhance current medical art, like our current body. So it seems like in 200, 500,000 years, whatever, it won't be like everyone is fully able-bodied. It'll be like everyone has been wounded and healed. Hence, they have become disabled and are healed or have some type of apparatus to help them compensate for their disability, right? That makes more sense, doesn't it? It does to me. So with everything I said in this video, and I would love to hear your comments about this, I think the better question, rather than asking, do people belong in sci-fi fantasy, is just, in a sci-fi fantasy world where you have unlimited magic and technology and whatever, what even justifies the presence of able-bodied people anymore? Unless you were born 5 minutes ago. You know, that's a better question as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Thank you to Steve Scheis for making the video. It was really interesting. And like the video if you did, check out his video as well. It'll be linked. And see you guys next time. Bye!